But we do know that the initial deployment of around 11,000 troops last October, the vast majority of these troops came from the North Korean elite special forces, the Storm Corps. Now, it is highly likely that any subsequent deployment, we know Kim Jong-un deployed a further 1,000 to 3,000 earlier this year, will come from less elite special forces, less elite groups of soldiers, purely on the grounds of numbers. But I think what is important is the intention. And I think on the part of North Korea is not pulling out of this war anytime soon, even despite the casualties that, as you've said, Pyongyang has openly admitted are taking place.
Hello and welcome to the Putin Files. I'm Louis Sykes. Today we're joined by Dr Edward Howell from the Department of Politics and International Relations at the University of Oxford. Dr Howell specialises in North Korean geopolitics. Dr Howell, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you very much. It's very good to be here.
Well, this week we've seen quite a dramatic ceremony in North Korea as soldiers killed fighting for Russia, where their bodies were returned to North Korea. What does this say about the depth of this growing alliance between Russia and the DPRK?
Well, at the end of April this year, both North Korea and Russia admitted for the first time the presence of North Korean troops in the Kursk region. This is something that commenced in October 2024 and is something about which we all already knew. It's interesting that you use the word alliance to describe the relationship between Russia and North Korea, because this is the word that North Korea has used and Kim Jong-un has used many times, particularly since the cooperation between the two countries strengthened after the first year of Putin's war against Ukraine. Russia, on the other hand, uses the word partnership, which perhaps implies that Russia views this relationship as something more transactional and less long-term. That said, I do believe that even though this relationship between North Korea and Russia started out as a transaction, North Korea giving Russia artillery shells at a time when no other country around the world was willing to assist Russia, and in return Russia providing North Korea with financial assistance, with food, with supplies of crude oil, and with what Kim Jong-un wants the most, namely advanced missile and military technology, and it's the latter about which we know the least, which is most concerning. This relationship has indeed escalated. And given the ongoing nature of the Ukraine war, and given how North Korea wants to gain benefits, particularly, as I have mentioned, the missile and military technology, North Korea is likely to send more troops. It has already shown that by doing so, it is not just a peripheral observer to this war, but an active participant.
What did you make of the nature of that ceremony itself? I mean, this seemed like a classic piece of sort of political theatre by the North Korean state, didn't it?
Indeed, and we saw Kim Jong-un notably have quite an emotional reaction at this ceremony. This is not the first time that he has cried in public or been seen to be crying in public, that has to be said. But what this shows is that, yes, North Korea knows that the war has a high death toll. Only last year, the average Russian death toll was just over 1,000 per day. It's a very rough approximation. And yes, we know that there have been North Korean casualties and North Korean deaths. But I think the message that we're seeing from North Korea is that, on the one hand, these troops who have fought, as the North Koreans would say, for their motherland in the name of Juche, this North Korean ideology, often translated as self-reliance. Actually, these people have fought for a worthy cause. They have died for a worthy cause. Kim Jong-un wants to give the impression that he is sorry that they have been killed. But this is not going to stop North Korea from sending more troops, because Kim Jong-un's main aim is to show Russia and show the world that North Korea is going all in to this war, because in so doing, it can get more from Russia.
And you mentioned the somewhat uneven way that these countries view each other. What's the history of the relations between Russia and North Korea?
The history is well known and it's very long-standing. We know that in the run-up to 1950, the Korean War, started by Kim Il-sung invading South Korea, initially Joseph Stalin did not want to grant Kim Il-sung permission to invade, but after concerted pressure from Kim Il-sung, discussions between Kim Il-sung and Mao and Stalin, Stalin gave Kim the green light. And as the Cold War progressed, North Korea was playing off Moscow and Beijing. But this did not mean that relations between Pyongyang and Moscow, akin to those between Pyongyang and Beijing, were always amicable and were always on good terms. At the end of the Cold War, following the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, China established diplomatic relations with South Korea in 1992. And in 1990, the Soviet Union established diplomatic relations with South Korea, which would continue between the Russian Federation and South Korea. This was viewed by North Korea as an act of betrayal. Pyongyang was left isolated. Its Cold War patrons were no longer its patrons. And so relations have been very uneven. The North Koreans did not have much time for Gorbachev, they had not much time for Yeltsin, but they did like Putin when Putin came into power. And the one thing I will say during Putin's tenure as the Russian leader is that in 2014, Putin agreed to pay off 90% of North Korea's Soviet-era debt. This highlighted to North Korea that perhaps Putin was a man with whom they could do business. What we're seeing now, therefore, is North Korea's relationship with Russia perhaps turning the Cold War dynamic on its head. During the Cold War, North Korea was dependent on the Soviet Union. But now, at a time of Russian need, it's North Korea that has come to help Russia by supplying artillery shells. 8, 9, 10 million rounds of artillery shells thus far, by supplying ballistic missiles, and crucially, since October 2024, manpower.
And we mentioned that manpower. We're hearing now that North Korea is pledging up to 30,000 more troops to Russia. That's a pretty major deployment for a country like North Korea, isn't it?
This is a very significant deployment, if true. The South Koreans, as we speak today, are yet to confirm this exact number. But I actually think the broader point that is worth mentioning is that it is unsurprising if North Korea were to send further deployments of troops. And the reason I say this is because only a couple of weeks ago, at a meeting between Sergei Shoigu and Kim Jong-un, North Korea agreed to send 5,000 to 6,000 construction workers, engineers, deminers to the Kursk region to assist in reconstruction. The deployment of additional North Korean troops, we do not know as to how they will be deployed, but we do know that the initial deployment of around 11,000 troops last October, the vast majority of these troops came from the North Korean elite special forces, the Storm Corps. Now, it is highly likely that any subsequent deployment, we know Kim Jong-un deployed a further 1,000 to 3,000 earlier this year, will come from less elite special forces, less elite groups of soldiers, purely on the grounds of numbers. But I think what is important is the intention. And I think on the part of North Korea is not pulling out of this war anytime soon, even despite the casualties that, as you've said, Pyongyang has openly admitted are taking place. And this is important because North Korea's relationship with Russia is not just in the security domain, it's expanded in economic sectors and across cultural sectors as well. And if we look at the treaty, the Comprehensive Strategic Partnership Treaty that was signed between Putin and Kim Jong-un on the 19th of June last year, it makes very clear, Article 10 of the treaty makes clear that the cooperation between the two countries goes across a range of sectors: information technology, industry, biology. And the final article of the treaty, Article 23, says quite clearly that this treaty will last indefinitely. And so even if the Ukraine war were to end, and in that situation, of course, North Korea would no longer need to supply artillery, missiles, or troops to Russia, the relationship, at least in my view, is not going to end suddenly, akin to how the Soviet Union and Russia basically dropped North Korea at the end of the Cold War.
And how much of an escalation will it be on the world stage if that many troops are deployed into Ukraine itself? I mean, from what we've seen so far, North Korea's involvement has largely been within Russia in the Kursk region. I understand there are some troops that have been seen fighting in Ukraine itself, but not in large numbers. I mean, could this set alarm bells ringing among, well, in Kiev certainly, but among Ukraine's allies and possibly even in the US?
What this highlights very clearly is that if there is one thing that the Ukraine war has taught the world, it is that the Euro-Atlantic and the Indo-Pacific theatres of conflict are not separate. They are inextricably intertwined, and North Korea's involvement in Russia's war very much confirms this. Any subsequent deployment of North Korean troops will have clear ramifications on the West and its policies towards North Korea, but also the West's approach to East Asia and the Indo-Pacific regions. I think it's very important to highlight how the North Korean threat is no longer simply confined to a country that is vertically proliferating nuclear weapons, delivery systems, and other forms of weapons of mass destruction. There is now another prong to this threat, the North Korea-Russia security cooperation, which started out as little more than a transaction, but as we're seeing is taking on new heights. Now, this is not to say that it, in the future, at some point could go back to being merely a transaction. As I've mentioned earlier, Russia terms the relationship with North Korea a partnership, perhaps to give Moscow a little bit of room to pull out, or pull back, more specifically, from this relationship if it feels that keeping this relationship going is not in its interests. But that does not mean to say that this relationship as it stands now is little more than a transaction. I think it's much more than a transaction, and we need to take not only the threat of North Korea seriously now, but North Korea's relationship with Russia. Why? Because Russia has been able, together with China, to render the UN Security Council to an impotent position, its most impotent since its establishment in 1945. And that is very concerning for the future of regional security, but also of global security. Because Russia and China continue to help North Korea evade sanctions. So the question is, moving forward, not only what can we do about North Korea's illegal nuclear weapons program, its ongoing egregious human rights violations, but also now its cooperation with Russia and with China.
And will the almost lack of action from the West on North Korea being drawn into this conflict have emboldened them, do you think, on those issues of nuclearization, militarization, and their human rights abuses as well?
In my view, North Korea is in a strong position at the moment. Lots of questions have been asked as to whether the new Trump administration will engage with Kim Jong-un, akin to how we witnessed in 2018 and 2019, when the two leaders met for 3 meetings across the space of 2 years. But now things have changed. Now North Korea has Russia. Kim Jong-un could plausibly meet with Trump, but Kim Jong-un could also very plausibly say that he does not want to meet with Trump now because he has Russia providing North Korea with all that it needs. I think we must also remember how the collapse of the Hanoi summit in February 2019, the summit that ended inconclusively with Trump and Kim Jong-un walking out, the two sides did not even have lunch, demonstrated quite clearly how North Korea remains unwilling to put its nuclear weapons, what it calls its treasured sword, on the negotiating table. And since then, North Korea has not even been pretending to want to talk with the United States, or South Korea, for that matter. Add to that the situation with the Ukraine war and Pyongyang's cooperation with Moscow, and North Korea is in an emboldened position at the moment.
There's one player we've discussed a little bit, but haven't addressed directly here, which is of course China. Previously, certainly the biggest ally for North Korea. Are they still North Korea's main and biggest ally? And what will they be making of the growing alliance between Russia and North Korea?
There is one narrative that says that China is angry about North Korea's relationship with Russia. I do not believe this to be the case. I think China is perhaps uneasy, perhaps it's feeling a little emetic, a little bit nauseous. China has refused to speak publicly about the North Korea-Russia relationship, saying that it's simply a bilateral relationship and it's not their business. In a way, perhaps it is their business, because China does not want to lose influence over the Korean Peninsula. China did sign the Armistice Agreement in 1953. But that said, I think China is perhaps sitting back and watching things develop and just letting these ties continue. Why? Because China does not want to be drawn into any broader conflict. China wants to preserve its economic ties with the West. China cares much more about its international status than Russia and North Korea. And if China were really angry about this rapprochement between North Korea and Russia, it could have done, or it could be doing, 2 things. The first is that Beijing could stop supplying Russia with dual-use technologies, which is enabling Moscow's war. And the second is that China could stop helping North Korea evade sanctions, ship-to-ship, port-to-port transfers of oil and petroleum products, for instance. Has Beijing done either of these things? The answer is no and no. So I do not believe that China is angry. China may be uneasy, it may be feeling a little bit uncomfortable, but China continues to enable Russia's war, and China continues to abet North Korea's violation of sanctions. This is clearly not the behavior of an actor that is angry about Pyongyang's cooperation with Moscow. It may be feeling uncomfortable, yes, but China, unlike Russia and North Korea, does care more about its international reputation.
Well, Dr. Edward Howell from the Department of Politics and International Relations at Oxford University, thank you very much for joining me today on the Putin Files.
Thank you very much.